You're listening to Boobies and Newbies, brought to you by the Frolic Podcast Network. Welcome to Boobies and Newbies, the podcast that asks novice romance readers to think outside the dick in a box and brave the unbridled world of erotica. I'm your host, Kelly Reynolds, and it is time for another Steamy Spotlight author interview. When I received a copy of Lauren Layne's upcoming release, To Sir with Love, available June 29th, I knew right away that I'd love it. I mean, what's not to love about a contemporary millennial take on Nora Ephron's You've Got Mail, one of my all-time favorite movies. Here to discuss her latest release, please join me in welcoming New York Times and USA Today best-selling author Lauren Layne.
Hi, and thank you so much for having me. One thing I have to say before we get started is that I could not click accept fast enough on this invitation when I saw that you had boobies in your podcast name. And I'm like, does that make me really juvenile? But I think I just have to tell you, I think Boobies and Newbies is just about the greatest title I've ever heard.
Oh, Thank you. I get a lot of love for the title, and I think it's honestly just a combination of the fact that I love punny things. I love words that rhyme. So like anytime I can put them together, I am happy to do so. And I feel like once you start a podcast with boobies or boobs in the title, it automatically becomes like part of your everyday vernacular. Like I feel like I say boobs and boobies a lot more now than I did when I was like 11 years old.
Yes. And I will say, like, probably before getting that invitation, I would have said like boobs, like in reference to boobs, but now I'm saying boobies. So you really rubbed off on me. I'm sure my husband is like, why is she talking about boobies? I'm like, well, because of this podcast.
Yep.
So thanks for that.
Take a shot every time you hear the word boobies.
It's going to be my new thing. So here we go.
Well, I have to say, first of all, that I'm excited to talk to somebody who's clearly as much of a fan of You've Got Mail as I am. So if we can just take a moment to hail the almighty queen of romantic comedies, Nora Ephron, I am here for that moment.
I mean, rest in peace. She is just a queen, I feel like there are so many people that worship her. So maybe I'm just like one of many, but there's just something about her storytelling and her dialogue that I find so inspiring, and it's something to reach for. And I sometimes feel like I'll never get there because she's like, she's the queen. She's my idol. So,
yeah.
Yes.
I'm with you. I mean, I went to school to study screenwriting with the very intention. I think I even have it on my website as like, hoping to be like the next Nora Ephron. Like this is like literally the goal that I aspire to, is to share even a comparison between Nora Ephron and myself.
Oh my gosh, I love that you say that, because the first quote I actually got for this book, or maybe one of the second ones, it was from an author, and I wasn't really familiar with the author at the time, but she gave me my first ever Nora Ephron comparison, and it was a bucket list moment. I mean, I know that that's so like dorky, but that's, I think, all I wanted for like 40 something books is for someone to say like, oh, Lauren Layne, Nora Ephron-esque, like even a like whiff of a comparison.
I love a good esque.
Yeah. Isn't it right? Like a little, just something fancy, a little flair.
And you know what? I would settle for like Nora Ephron-ish. Like I'd take an ish over an esque.
I would take an ish. I would honestly just like to be in the same sentence. So that was that was huge. I love to hearing another fan, because I feel like that movie, Sleepless in Seattle gets so much love, and I love that one too. I'm actually from Seattle, and I think people assume that that's going to be my like Nora Ephron story. But now I live in New York, and even before I moved to New York, still when I was in Seattle, this was the movie for me, is You've Got Mail. It's just, I think it's magical. I don't know how to describe it.
I was raised on rom-coms of the 90s, but also the oldies, because there's a reference in this book to Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn, and like these are the movies that my parents brought me up on, was like watching Bringing Up Baby and all the great oldie before we even called them rom-coms, and they were like screwball comedies. So This, yeah, You've Got Mail, though, was one of the ones where I remember actually seeing that one in theaters. And I was probably
Same,
too young to be going to see it,
same,
but
same.
also, absolutely adored it at whatever age that is, just as much as I do. Well, I probably love it even more now because I understand everything that's going on in it a lot better than I did at, say, 7. But yeah, God, what a great movie.
It is, and it's one of those movies because yeah, I was the same. Saw it in theaters, and I was probably I'm trying to think now. I don't even remember when it came out. I was maybe junior high-ish, I'm guessing, and it was the same. Like I loved it, and I've always loved it. But I swear, every time I watch it, there's some new nuance that I miss.
Yes.
Like a little, especially I think as I've gotten older. What's I feel like I should know. Meg Ryan's boyfriend.
Oh, well, it's Greg
You know that.
Kinnear, is the
Yeah, what's his
actor. What is his
I'm
name in
forgetting
it? I forget what his
I'm
name
forgetting his
is.
name is too. I feel so disloyal to the movie, but whatever. Greg's character, I feel like I never really appreciated like how funny and nuanced he is in that movie. And every time I watch it, I'm like, oh, like he's a great character. Like Parker Posey playing Tom Hanks. Like it's all those like those elements that you don't very often see in rom coms, especially new rom coms.
Yeah.
Where there's is a different tone. I just love the complexities that Nora put in that movie. Blow
His
me away every time.
his name, by the way, is Frank Navasky.
Frank. Yes, Frank.
And
Thank
Parker
you.
Posey played Patricia.
Patricia,
Yeah,
of
no,
course.
I love that movie. I mean, what I love about her movies in general is that they feel like real relationships. Like they feel, I mean, you have like this connection between, in fact, I listened to a podcast recently that was talking about You've Got Mail and like how, oh my God, this is so shady. It's these people in a relationship and like they're talking to other people. And I'm like, yeah, but like this was like when the internet was like first happening and like they're having this like connection that they're not having like with their partners. And it's very different. And I feel like today that actually applies a lot better too because we have lots of people talking about like different ways to have relationships today, whether it's open or poly or whatever, where you're not getting something from somebody, like maybe you're getting it from somebody else. So I don't know. I think it's a great movie that's like stood the test of time for sure.
I absolutely agree. And it's funny you bring up that I'm saying it's funny. It's so isn't it so funny that you bring it up? I think we're just like brain twins is what's happening here because everything you've said on this between like the peanut butter and Nora Ephron, I'm like, she's in my head. But that whole idea of your hero and heroine or, whatever story structure being in a relationship, it is a bit of a taboo, like in the romance world.
Yeah.
And I think I get it because especially like early on in my romance reading career, very much if there was even like a hint of another woman or other woman, I'm like, no, no, no. Like it
Yeah.
just it bothered me. But as I've gotten a little bit more, I think, into the writing side of things, I don't want to say that I necessarily think it belongs in every story, but it is such a wonderfully complex way of, like you said, making people real, but then also it adds tension.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something I don't think people realize until you don't have it, how important it is. But the second you put them in a relationship or a flirtation or whatever, like even if you insert little elements of jealousy, and I'm talking little elements, you don't want to read an entire book of
Not
like this
full
jealous
blown
mess.
cheating. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, if there is kind of this like, well, why can't they be together right now? And it's like, well, it's complicated because life is complicated and relationships are complicated. And, most of us go through many different partners before we find the one. And sometimes the one is just one of our many ones as we go through
Oh, I love
our
that.
evolution.
One of our many ones, because that's something that I absolutely subscribe to, is not necessarily like I mean, even our main character in this book has what we call like the Cinderella complex, where she's like looking for that perfect fit, that Prince
Yeah,
Charming. And there's the eventually, for most of us, I think, the realization of like, oh well, we can have this moment with like many different people and
exactly.
it's still a
Yep.
great fit. It just fits differently than, say, like the next person.
Yep. Yep.
Good old Nora
Yes.
Ephron setting us up.
Yeah. I know they were just like in awe right now.
Yeah. Well, and I will say, when I first received an arc for To Sir with Love, my immediate thought was, oh, damn, this would have been the perfect book to talk about during our digital love series in March. But I do actually want to point out something that you wrote in your author's note that really struck me. I, first of all, recommend everybody always reads like the acknowledgments and author's notes in books, because I think obviously there's some work and thought that goes into it on your behalf, but also that I think there's lots of little juicy details to find within there that'll like help inform your reading of the book. But this was something that you wrote, excuse me while I quote you for a moment, and that is that this is not a story about technology or the specific means of communication. This is a story about hope. It's about determined optimism that the person on the other side of that written communication will be every bit as wonderful as he or she seems to be. And I love that, because I think this is a narrative that we're all familiar with, whether it's, you know, You've Got Mail or The Shop Around the Corner, or I know you mentioned Parfumerie as being the inspiration. So it's less about like, well, this is a digital book. This is like about modern dating and dating apps, you know, and more about, well, why do we keep coming back to this situation and scenario? It's that hope. It's that hope that you want that person to be every bit that you dream them up to be.
Exactly. And there is, you know, there's a little part of me that is aware, and I love it. Like I said, Nora Ephron comparisons are my favorite, but the book does get a lot of comparisons to You've Got Mail, and I will be fully transparent here, where when I was like, well, what do I want to write next? As long as I can remember, I think going back to like 2014, right as I was starting my career, on my bucket list of what I write is You've Got Mail. Like I want to write You've Got Mail my way. So, well, I mean, I absolutely did base it on You've Got Mail and Shop Around the Corner, which also, to your point about old movies, is another just classic. And I think a lot of people don't know, like Nora Ephron's story, You've Got Mail isn't an original. Like that's based on Shop Around the Corner, and Shop Around the Corner is not an original. It's based on Perfumery. And yeah, to your point, it's a, why do we keep coming back to that? And there is something just so magnetic, I think. And I think romantic. I can't think of anything more romantic than this idea that you were connecting with someone without seeing their face, and sort of that I don't know if you want to call it like butterflies, or like that knot in the stomach when you hear that You've Got Mail, or in, you know, Gracie and Sebastian's case, like the buzz of the phone or the little notification, and just that very unique, I think very special, almost kind of old fashioned, or I don't want to say childish because it's not, but like, you know, almost kind of like a high school kind of love, like where you're waiting for like someone to like look across the room at you and like your eyes lock. It's that very innocent sort of sweet hope, and romance that really appealed to me when writing this one.
To borrow from another New Yorker, Carrie Bradshaw, she calls it the Zaza Zoo on Sex and the City. That
she does.
Even if it fades, you'll always have the memory of the Zaza Zoo.
Yes, you were so right. That is, and it's that, that's a great way to put it, because there's no rational way to explain it. You feel it.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's trying to explain what that is like next to impossible. It's just a feeling. It's just a feeling, and you know, I know it sounds cliched, but you know it when you feel it, kind of thing.
You do.
And we see that in the book. I mean, and I like that, you know, all the different movies we've mentioned and like how they've informed like future iterations like of the same story is just, it goes to show you that, like, you know, technology may change, like we might change, but love and hope are like two eternal themes that like anybody, no matter where we are in the world, no matter what year it is, can connect with.
Exactly. Yeah. There's a sort of a universality, I think, to the idea of this. I don't know, like, it's not a distant love, because that's not quite the right word.
Right.
But it's like I say, these people connecting in a way that's different than the, you know, like the face to face, or even like the Facebook chat. It's a little more whimsical.
Which I don't know about you, but I mean, this is like what I think of when I think of modern love, because it's like, so, I mean, this is how we date nowadays, is via app. And, you know, so I was like, oh, this isn't even like so far removed for me, like in 2021. This just seems like the new normal.
It is normal. And even like, I've been married for years now, and my husband and I live in a very small Manhattan apartment, and yet we still text each other from that apartment. So it's not just dating, it's also being married and living in the same space. It's still, I don't know, sometimes if he's in the other room, I'm like, you want breakfast?
Bring me chips.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Or he'll say like, you want another cup of coffee? And I'm like, yeah. but
Thanks.
it's through emojis too, like
Oh,
heart, coffee. Yeah,
love you
that's
too,
my life.
babe. I'll bring you coffee. I love that.
XO, XO.
Oh God, that's so great. Yeah, no, I am okay. Well, you mentioned that You've Got Mail retelling was like at the top of your bucket list when you became a writer, and so I'd love to kind of take you back, and ask, sort of how your romance origin story began, how you came into reading romance, and in fact, if you remember the first romance novel you read, I mean, that'd be fabulous, but no pressure.
Yeah, no, I like because this is one that comes up a lot, and I think especially with my parents and specifically my mom, because my mom is a reader.
Mm.
Like she loves to read, and she got me started. Like both my parents, so like they just bought my sister and I books from a very young age, and I really took to it. My sister is much sportier than me, much more coordinated. I was the one in the corner with the books, so I've always been a reader. But something so weird happened to me, and when I'm looking back, I feel like it was before puberty, which seems weird, but this is how it is in my memory. And it was Sweet Valley Twins, so not even Sweet Valley High, but like the ones that are set.
Oh.
I think they're like in sixth grade, and it was a purple cover, and it was Elizabeth's first kiss, and
Ooh.
it was I think they were like outside, like, and it was Elizabeth and Todd, and I think the kiss happened at the end of the book, and it was just like a peck on the cheek, and I remember just being like riveted. And I liked kind of like all those books because I read everything, but I liked those light and fun ones. But there was something about that there was like a seed planted, I think, in that moment. And I remember reading it over Christmas and my aunt giving me a hard time, being like, "Oh, first kiss." And that was like the first time I ever learned to hide the covers. Because people will mock you, for this, for your love of this. But
Man,
that
and you
was,
weren't even hiding like, bodice strippers. You were hiding Sweet Valley
yeah.
children.
There were no boobies, right? This was like an innocent, like, I don't know, teen, not even teen, preteen love story, I guess. So that was my first hint that I loved romance, and then I think it evolved, and I'm forgetting like the series, and I don't know if they even still write them, but for a while there was like a young adult line kind of romance novels where it was like high school kids in
Yes,
love.
that's actually,
You know what I'm
I
talking
feel
about?
like another author I've talked to on the podcast has mentioned that. And I think I forget if it was a Harlequin line or what, but I know that this has come up before, and it's something that I totally missed because I came into reading romance later. So I don't know. I wonder if they're still making this.
I wonder too, and I don't think they are because I can kind of vaguely remember, and there weren't a ton of them. Like it wasn't like romance where it was like this huge shelf, but I remember it being in like the young adult or the teen section of Barnes and Nobles or Borders back then, because that was my
Bored.
local bookstore.
R.I.P.
Yeah, I know. It's always whenever a bookstore closes, it's like, speaking of You've Got Mail, because it ties right in, but it's
Yep.
like your heart kind of just breaks.
Uh,
But so I would go into Borders, and there would be a young adult section, and there would be these books, and I don't remember what they are. I don't remember specific titles, but that was another part of the journey, was these books, which they were romantic, and they didn't have sex scenes, but this by now they were kissing on the lips, right? Because we're high school.
Whoa.
Yeah, and I'm like, oh, I love these books. And then I think my first romance novel, and I have kind of two, and I don't remember which one I read first, but I know they both came from my mom, who doesn't really read romance, but she does like, like a beach read of which I now know is romantic suspense. I
Mm,
think she bought them for the suspense factor. I picked them up for the romance factor. One was Sandra Brown's The Exclusive,
okay.
which she picked up, and that like it does, like, I mean, the cover didn't look like a romance, it looked like a political mystery, and I read anything, sorry, but there was a really hot romance in there, like, with I think those are probably like the first sex scenes that I read. I was like, whoa. So that was one. And then another one was, and this was a little bit more straight romance, was Nora Roberts' The Reef. And I remember
Yes.
my mom, and it's just classic, and it has like other stuff in there too. It's one of her kind of like bigger, more plot driven books. But my mom had just come home from Costco, and she had like put all the stuff on the counter, and then she was like, "Hey, can you put these away? I have to go pick up your sister from soccer." There's that sporty thing again. Me reading the books, and my sister at soccer. But yeah, The Reef was there, and I remember I just sat down in this little chair we had in the kitchen and started reading, and that was really a moment for me. That was
Mm.
like, I'd always wanted, in like vague terms, to be an author. So that I kind of always knew. But I read this, I'm like, this is what I want to write. Like, this is what I like to read. This is what I want to write. And from then on, I went and read like every romance that like Judy
Yeah.
McNaught and, Nora Roberts, her whole backlist. Julia Quinn, which is so funny. The Duke and I
Uh-huh.
was one of my first ever romance. People were like, "Oh, you seen Bridgerton?" I'm like, "Don't try to tell me about Bridgerton." Like I was with Julia Quinn from the very beginning, from like the very first printing of that book. So
That's so
that's a really
funny.
long version.
Yeah. Well, but I love that, there's like a clear-cut moment of like, not like, yes, I've always wanted to be a writer, but like now I know what I want to write. Like this is that moment. This is
Yes,
that book. And I'm a fan of I'm a fan of Nora Roberts. I feel like Nora Roberts was one of my earlier reads too. I think she's a great introduction to romance too for a lot of like newbie
agreed.
romance readers. Her Bride Quartet series is one of my favorites. Like I will go back and reread it because I just think it's so cute. Like I love series about like female friendships, and like that's just as important as the romance. That's like one of my favorite things to read.
Yeah, and her banter is so good with those female friends. And she has a couple set in Ireland, and I'm not Irish, and I'm obviously not a witch, but she has some of like witch ones over there. And I don't know if I'm like, I don't know what it is about these Irish witch books from Nora Roberts, but I probably read them like 10,000 times. And there's like magic and like,
I
like stuff's
mean,
floating
you
around.
had me at Irish and witch. Like that's all I needed to know that like, oh yeah,
Yeah, oh
I
yeah.
really like this.
If you just go Google like Nora Roberts Ireland Witch, I think she has a couple series. I'm forgetting the title names, but they're incredible. They're so good.
I love that. Well, okay, so I've mentioned To Sir with Love, obviously, the book we're talking about today, your new release, June 29th, for everybody that, is only a few days away at this point. So please go pick yourself up a copy, pre-order, do what you have to do to get your hands on it. But I've mentioned that this is, a fresh take on a story we're familiar with. So I'd love to know from the author herself, would you mind giving everyone a brief synopsis of To Sir with Love?
Of course, yeah. So the very, very short version is that this is a modern-ish nod to You've Got Mail. And instead of AOL, we're dealing with a dating app. But sort of the leaving that comparison aside, the nuances in my version is she's very much a middle child. The heroine is
Yes.
Gracie. And that's actually, I'm the oldest. So this was the thing, but I wanted this to be a big part of her identity. But so it's a middle child who's very much a people pleaser. And she's always sort of been the one that's been balancing her brother and her sister. And she is the one, when their father passes away, that actually gives up her dreams of art school to take over the family business, which, as far as family businesses go, is pretty great. It's a champagne shop.
That's awesome, by
And
the
so
way. I loved that.
there was no doubt in my mind. I'm like, well, it can't be like a bookstore, but she had to have a business. I'm like, well, champagne. It's like the second best thing to book. So we have Bubbles. Actually, the store is called Bubbles.
And
So
more.
she's Bubbles and more, which is a key part of the story. But yeah, so it's sort of her journey of having this store that she inherited, and she thinks that she loves it until Sebastian comes in, and Sebastian is like this big bad corporate guy. If you have seen You've Got Mail and you're picturing Tom Hanks, that's actually incorrect. I made him much more, in my head, he's a bit of a Mr. Darcy character.
Okay.
Um, because he's a little bit a little more reserved, a little bit crustier, and
Yeah.
Tom Hanks is so charming. I would say Sebastian's a little bit more rough around the edges and a little bit uptight. But so they of course have this very antagonistic battle because he wants to take over the shop, and she's like, screw you. But of course they keep bumping into each other, and like sparks are flying, which is conflicting to Gracie because she is fancying herself in love with the mysterious Sir, who she's met over a dating app, but not in real life. And of course, not really a spoiler here, they are in one and the same. And it's really just this fun. It was actually really fun, I think, to take that story where the reader knows from the very beginning, obviously, that the back of the book explains it. I think the front of the cover may even say it. But it's taking this, and like the reader knows the entire time and the characters not knowing, and sort of that tension. I think this is a really weird description of the book. I went off on a tangent.
No, I think it's all there. I think you've covered all your bases well. And what I love about, the book, but also just like this story in general, is like you get to see the characters fall in love twice. Like it's over, their text messages together, and then it's over them actually like getting to know each other in real life, IRL, if you will. And I love that. That's like one of my favorite moments in You've Got Mail is that moment when they do finally meet, knowing exactly who everybody is and that this is somebody she's already known from messaging, and that the line, I wanted it to be you. Like, I really wanted it
Yeah.
to be you. Like, it's that sticks with you. And it's hard to make characters fall in love once, let alone twice.
It was harder than I thought because I've been so excited about telling the story for so long. And I kind of knew that this was going to be the year, even before Gallery purchased the book. I told my agent, I'm like, I'm writing this, and I'm like, if I have to self-publish it, I'll self-publish it. Like this is story is getting told. But it was a joy to write. It was very, very fun, but it was trickier than I thought. Like you
Mm,
said, to have them fall in love twice. But then the hardest part was you have to keep that balance because you don't want her to fall too much in love with Sir, because then it's not going to ring true when she has
right.
this chemistry with Sebastian. And at the same time, she can't hit it off too hard with Sebastian too soon because she's supposed to be, smitten with this guy over here. So that was actually, it took several revisions, and going back and forth. And my editor was great, we were kind of like, okay, is this too much for Sebastian to say this early on?
Mm.
And in some cases, it was solely because we had to make sure that he wasn't pulling ahead of Sir. He wasn't pulling ahead of himself.
Yeah, it's a
Um,
race with himself, like
it
competing
was,
for
it
her
was,
love.
and it was just a strange. It was rewarding, but it was the strangest challenge.
That is kind of funny to think about, like writing a love triangle, really, if you think about it, between like themselves, like him in two different versions of himself with the same woman.
Yeah. Well, and two, like making sure, like, because we want to make sure that they're both their authentic selves
Yes.
in both versions, but they can't be like too much themselves because then they would reveal, like I had to like hide this reveal until the end of the book so we get that payoff. So that was it was easier with Sebastian because, like I said, he is a little bit more reserved
Hmm.
in real life. And I picture that as just him being shy. Whereas so then his Sir self, he lets loose a little bit more. So he's a little bit easier, um, like easier personality
Yeah.
wise when he's in the text message, the messaging form. But Gracie is very much like a put yourself out there, and she's so warm and so bubbly in both her writing and her real life persona. I was always like, Gracie, like don't give yourself away, like trying to like censor her without really censoring who she is as a character was
Well,
an adventure.
and you bring up an interesting point in that maybe it's because I was reading this book at the same time that I was watching season 2 of The Circle on Netflix, which, by the way, have you seen it?
No, I haven't yet.
Okay,
Is
we'll get
it
to that in a second. But
okay?
the whole idea behind The Circle is that, it's people competing to, I guess, just you would say, like, to be the most popular, but it's through a like digital messaging system where they never actually get to meet each other in real life. And so some people can catfish. I mean, anybody can catfish. Some of them do choose to do that. But while reading this book and watching The Circle, I kept thinking about like this idea of like when we're online and we have this online persona, whether it's through social media or dating profiles or whatever, I feel like the initial thought that I think a lot of us have is like, oh, well, like this person is just like being fake. Like they're just giving us the best version of themselves online. But at the same time, I think there's something to be said about people feeling a lot more open and honest when they can hide behind like a computer screen or a text message. Like we've seen it with internet trolls for sure. I mean,
I was just gonna bring up,
feeling
yeah, that.
yeah. And so I don't know. It's interesting to think about because I've dabbled in online dating for the better part of, I don't know, a decade at this point. And so it's interesting to me to think about like, well, when you're talking to somebody online, are you talking to like the version of themselves they want you to see, or are you really talking to like their most authentic self?
Yep, and I think there is something too about, like you said, when you're online, and especially when there's no face involved, no picture,
Yeah.
which is the case in this book, you are able to really, I think, say things that you might not in real life.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, maybe to my point about Gracie, maybe that is sort of what's so special for her is like all of a sudden she can get to not so much just the bubbly Gracie, the people pleasing, the one that's always trying to make sure that everybody is happy. It's maybe she's finally free to be this other person that's a little bit more vulnerable, or she gets mad, or she gets upset, or she gets hurt, because she is hurt by Sebastian.
Yeah.
And it's really just, ironically, it's to Sir that she can sort of finally allude to this, where she may not tell, her friends in real life, because
Mhm.
she has to preserve her persona, right? Her sparkly, bubbly self.
I can identify with that 100%. I mean, although I will say I'm an only child, so like reading about any sort of like family dynamic with like multiple siblings is like it's like a scientific study for me, because I'm just like, why are they doing these things?
Yeah, this is
Oh, it's a
interesting.
middle child thing. Oh, okay. What is this middle child? I have no idea.
Tell me more. I know I kind of like, and I have, like I said, I'm the oldest. I only have one sister, and we have I think a pretty good relationship. We didn't really fight that much growing up. We don't fight at all as adults. So it's even kind of funny if I'm writing a sibling relationship that's not quite as friendly. I'm the same as you. I'm like, well, what does that look like? And then I feel like I start like peeping on other people's conversation. I'm
Yeah.
like, okay, they're related, and they seem tense.
I was
So
going to
what's
say,
that
I
like?
can definitely give you a few people for references if you need it.
It is, yeah, because it's like, you feel half done, like you think your reality is the only reality, and
Yeah.
that's one of the more challenging things about, I think, being a writer, just being a human, is like, oh yeah, like our experience isn't universal. There are other things happening around us.
Very true. That being said, I think you do need to go watch The Circle on Netflix. I think everybody
I know
should.
that's next on my agenda.
Okay.
That, and actually, and I don't even know if it's new or old, but is it Love is
Love is
Blind?
Blind. Oh my God. Can we?
So, okay,
Mm.
I have to tell you this. I had, until I got the marketing copy for To Serve with Love, which Gallery, my publisher, came up with me, and they, of course, you've got mail references, obvious, but then they sent the copy back for the back of the book, and it said Love is Blind meets You've Got Mail, and I was like,
Yeah.
what the heck is Love is Blind? I had never heard of it. I had never, and I still to this day I don't know what it is, because
Okay.
I haven't had a chance to Google it. And everybody mentions, they're like, oh, it's like Love is
Lauren.
Blind, and I'm like, apparently it's like Love is
Yeah,
Blind.
no.
Tell me what I need
Let
to
me
know.
tell you. So, in the early pandemic days, like I'm talking back in, well, I guess I'm trying to think if it came, I think it did come out in the pandemic, cuz like the shows that I remember from like the beginning of the pandemic were Tiger King, Love is Blind, and The Circle. And it was just like the series of reality shows that they were releasing on Netflix. And Love is Blind, the whole concept is that men and women are separated into like these little cubicle rooms, and they talk back and forth through a wall, and they're not allowed to see each other in real life until one of them proposes and they agree.
Oh wow,
Mhm.
intense.
Yeah, and then so they basically pair up the couples by the end of like, I don't know, the second episode. And not all of them. I think they start with like maybe like 20 people, and only like 6 couples like move forward or something like that. And then the rest of the show is kind of them on like a month-long journey to the altar, and like, are we gonna make it? They have to try
Interesting.
living together, they have to meet each other's families, they go on like a vacation together and all this. It's just like extreme dating, in like a short amount of time. And it's so, I mean, when you think about it, it is very much Love is
It
Blind, in
is.
that
It is.
they don't see each other consciously, at least,
Right.
until they decide to meet.
Oh my goodness. It's so, and you know what? It's like I've had a couple people, not in an accusatory way, just say like, "Oh, it's so clear you were inspired by this." And I was like, "No," because like, I mean, that's what I think people a lot of times assume is like that we writers are constantly taking these immediate things. And I'm like,
Right.
most of the time, like we've had something planned for like months, and
Yes.
but I think it's so interesting. It's like the universe, or like the muse or fate, seems to like drop things in our lap, or back in our lap in my case, at exactly the right time, or like
Yeah.
this is an apropos comparison, which is so neat.
That's even funnier, though. I feel like I love your book even more now, knowing that you didn't watch Love is Blind.
Yeah, nope, not until I said, like, I got this marketing copy, and I'm like, I kind of thought it was a mistake. I'm like, is this like a movie I haven't seen, or like maybe they were like confusing my book with someone else? But then, yeah, it's been like across the board, like podcast interviews, reader questions, like, oh, so like Love is Blind. I'm like, I guess, sure.
Yeah, I will say I enjoyed The Circle much more than I did Love is Blind. Love is Blind is kind of one of those like train wreck shows where you're like, ooh,
Uh,
I know this is gonna go bad for so many reasons, but I have to keep watching like for that. The Circle is just enjoyable, fun people pretending to be older, younger, different gendered people. Like I love it.
okay, so I'll start with The Circle. Will be my next watch.
Yeah.
Okay,
Okay, good. I'm
thank
glad.
you.
I'm glad. So another thing that I noticed while reading the book, obviously you mentioned the champagne shop, Bubbles and More. And I have to know, I feel like you had to do some research when it came to champagne and sparkling wine, or it could just be that I am so uncultured when it comes to champagne and sparkling wine that there were so many things that I was like, oh, didn't know that.
Yeah, I did have to do like a little bit of research, but to be honest, most of it was stuff that I know.
Good for
And
you.
only because so, and I like even like going back to like my earliest, like when I was 21, like I've always really liked champagne. And my in-laws who are very into wine and are very generous, I want to say it was like, I don't know, 20, 23,
Uh-huh.
quite young. But they gave us this fancy-ish, my husband and I, this fancy-ish champagne tasting. So we went in there, and it was at like this very fancy restaurant. It was like a date night. So we were
Mm-hmm.
like decked out. And first of all, I was pretty smitten with the whole process because they put out Lay's potato chips and popcorn, and they had
What?
explained that actually like salty, greasy is like the best possible pairing with champagne. So we were having this like really amazing champagne, which in hindsight now was quite expensive, with like the cheapest potato chips, and it was I think just like microwave popcorn. And to this day, I still serve like if we ever had like champagne or like celebration, I'm like, oh, where are the
Yes.
chips? Like I just put them in a pretty bowl, and it's like the best snack in the world, and everybody loves it. Tangent about the chips, but back to the champagne. One thing that I learned, and I think I just found it so fascinating, was that we all say champagne as a general term, but actually you can only champagne from the Champagne region of France is called champagne. Everything else is sparkling wine. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? Like, what is everything else? And so going into like all the ones from California, which was, that was in my budget. So I'm like, yeah, that's champagne, but it's actually not. And you're not legally allowed to call it that. So I think I had just from that early tasting, I was just fascinated that we all get it wrong, right? We call anything that's sparkling champagne.
Right.
And so I started to learn about all the different ones, and like Franciacorta and Cava and all of those are actually ones that like I've tasted and like totally geeked out on, that I built into the story.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, no. Well, first of all, I love the potato chip and popcorn tangent because I feel like maybe I've just been drinking champagne wrong all these years, and like I would like it a lot more, or sparkling wine for that matter, if I had it with potato chips and popcorn. I'm not like a big drinker in general, so like I'm very uncultured when it comes to like wine, beer even, and sparkling wines. And so all of it was like news to me. And I feel like the one thing I did know was that we only call champagne champagne if it's from Champagne. And my response to that is, well, shouldn't we be calling like all of the different sparkling wines like after their like respective regions then? Like, shouldn't we call it from California like, well, this is Sonoma or this is
Right,
Napa?
right. Yes, I'm like kind of love like the French that just decided to like claim this whole word, but all right, guys, all
This is
right.
ours and only ours.
Exactly.
I love France. But yeah, no, I thought that was so fun. And what a fun business to put into a story. I don't know if I've actually ever read a book that's had the main character have a champagne shop, because I think there's also something to be said for, speaking as somebody who orders food online a lot and has it delivered, there's something to be said for, especially during a pandemic, which is obviously something you could never have planned for with this book, like supporting small businesses and,
Yeah.
actually going into the stores and like having that interaction with people.
Yep, yep. And it was something too, and I don't want to give away too much of the way that the book ends. But I also, it was important to me in the same way in You've Got Mail, Barnes and Noble, well, Fox Books, but
Fox.
based on Barnes and Noble, Fox Books, like when those big bookstores came in, they did put like the little bookstores out of business in a
Yeah.
big way. And so I was trying to figure out like sort of what would be a business that would be fun, because this is fiction, right? Like I'm writing a fairy tale essentially, but that also would be believable. I'm like, well, would that survive, or would some big corporate company come in and trying to buy up the space? Because the champagne shop, it's great in theory, but like you
Yeah.
said, everybody's buying online, and that's a big part of the story as well. Like, do we go into e-commerce, which everybody is doing? So it was sort of like me trying to make it like as realistic as possible, but also in a fun way. And what's more fun than a champagne shop that sells art in the back corner?
Yeah,
So
and little gifts and everything. I mean, you describe it perfectly in the book as like it's the place to go into like before a bachelorette party or a wedding shower or something, where it's like you have to grab the cute gift, you grab some booze,
yeah,
and that's like my kind of store. Like I live for like gift shops. Like honestly, I wish there were more like fun,
me
cutesy
too.
gift shops like on every corner.
And like I put, people have asked like what did you base it on, or what was the inspiration? And that is 100% in my head. Like there is not a champagne shop that I know of in New York or anywhere that I've been to. And then also like gift shops are just too rare. So I
Yes.
was really, and I have like this very, if I had any art skills, I would draw it and put it on my website, because I have such a clear vision of what the shop looks like, and it's just
Oh,
my dream
I
shop.
want
It's
to
like what
see
you would say,
it. I want to see
like
you draw it. I want to see the shop.
Maybe I'll do my best. It'll have like a lot of like blobs that just says like wine rack, but yeah, it's one. And I'm not like terribly visual when I write. To an extent, I think all writers, we have to imagine as we're going along. But like for the most part, like even my characters, I kind of have them more as like loose, almost more like shadows, because I really want readers to be able to put their, I'll give some
Yeah.
physical descriptions, but it's important to me that readers can picture them in their way without me being like, well, there's a freckle just below her left eye. But in the case of this wine shop, I was getting like really into it. And I'm like, to the right over here is the French section. And then we have Spanish. So
You're like,
it was
she
a
could be
fun.
a brunette or a redhead, but this is exactly what this
Yep.
shop looks like.
The table is exactly 3 feet and it's round. Yeah.
I actually, personally, I appreciate that because when I write, I do not think about what characters look like as much, like unless it specifically informs the story. But no, I'm with you. I like having kind of like a vague idea of like, oh, okay, this is a 33-year-old woman. She lives in Manhattan. She's lived here. I'm like, I can already picture like what this person looks like just based off of
Right.
that. And then I can insert myself, into the middle child
Well,
shoes.
and I'm wondering if that's because you said that you went to school for screenwriting,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And I think, and I've done some screenwriting myself, and one of the ways that I kind of like dipped my toe in early days was Shonda Rhimes, her masterclass
Oh,
on
yeah.
TV writing. And I it's such a great point that I hadn't thought about, because it's different than novels. But she had said, like, don't get really attached to what these characters look like, because you have no idea who's going to be
You don't get to
cast.
cast them. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And something about that really stood out to me. And I was like, well, gosh, how freeing, even for fiction writing, for novels. And then
Hmm.
right on the heels of that, I'd read some interview with Stephen King, who admittedly I don't read a lot of his stuff, because horror is not really my genre, but I have a ton of respect for his process, and he's
Yeah.
obviously built a huge empire. And he had a similar sentiment where he said really that the details should come alive. They should be clear in the author's head, but more so in the readers. So give them just enough so that they can figure out, like, like maybe height, but maybe not, just sort of like age and
Yeah. No, I think
where they're
that's
from, or
great
if they have an
advice.
accent.
I think that's great advice. Well, and it's something that, I teach online like introductory like screenwriting and creative writing courses for a university. And so a lot of the times when I am teaching screenwriting, my students will ask, well, like how descriptive should I be of like introducing my characters? And I'm like, well, it depends what you think of like as descriptive, because like a lot of introductory texts will tell you like, tell us their age, their race, what they're wearing, and all this stuff. And I'm like, well, I think that's important in some cases, but at the same time, if you're just telling us they're wearing a white t-shirt and black jeans, like what is this really telling us about this character? If they're wearing ripped jeans that, probably they bought 10 years ago and haven't grown out of, or had the money to buy more jeans, like that tells us a lot more about the person, you know? So, you know, I think it depends on the story itself, but I like being able to insert myself into a story, and especially all those books we've seen turn into movies and TV shows. Somebody's always upset about the casting because it's not the redhead they pictured for the last 5 years.
Well, and I wonder if like there's a part of me too that's like I'm emotionally bracing for that. If knock on wood, any of my works do get turned into TV or movies, like I'm like I don't want to be upset by like the casting decision. And so like the more removed I think I can be is I think the better.
You're a
Which is
writer, but also a fan.
exactly, yeah, yeah. Well, and I think it's so freeing. When I wrote my first screenplay, taking some of those details, I'm like, this is so freeing compared to, and you know, so writing the books is still, I think, my first love. But yeah, there's something kind of nice about writing like the essence of a person without having to get really into the nitty gritty details about how long her eyelashes are or whatever.
I agree. Well, and so one other thing I wanted to ask you about was the fact that you set the book in New York. Now, obviously, do you consider yourself a New Yorker? Or do you consider yourself somebody who lives in New York? I never know where we draw the line.
I don't either. And, you know, I do consider myself a New Yorker, but I say it a little bit hesitantly because the people that were like born in New York, I'm like, well, yeah, you're a New Yorker. But I've lived here, you know, 10 years on and off, and it just, you know, it feels like home, even though, you know, I've lived in Seattle most of the time. But yeah, it's home. It's where I want to be. We left for a while because it was only meant to be a 2-year stint, and we went back to Seattle. And the story I always tell is like we've had like one foot out the car in Seattle, and we were excited to go home. Our family's there, friends are there, and it's like we stepped out of the car and it felt wrong.
Yeah.
I know that sounds so like woo woo or whatever, but it was. I think in that moment we're like, well, I guess we gotta get back to New York.
Turn the car around.
Yeah. And you know, and so it took a couple of years because New York is so expensive, and this was the beginning of my career, and I was making like actual pennies, if that, mostly not even that. So yeah, there was that element of coming back to New York. But to get back to your question, yeah, I do consider myself a New Yorker, but I will happily bow down to those that have lived here longer because there is, I think, a scale of New Yorkness.
It's a conversation I've had with several who I call New Yorkers, of just sort of like, when do you consider yourself a New Yorker? And so it always cracks me up just to hear like what people say. But the reason I brought it up is because I don't know about you, but I feel like every time I read a book, and I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area, I feel like every time I read a book set in a city that I'm familiar with, I get like super nitpicky about like things that they mention. And so I'm wondering, as somebody who lives in New York, and maybe you can speak to Seattle too, whenever you read a book, do you ever find yourself getting caught up on like the minute details of like New York life?
A little bit. And I try to be forgiving, mainly because I have written books that are set in places that I haven't lived. And so, but I always try to be as vague as possible, or like I try to do my research, or I just like make up streets. Like I don't try to do it, but it's little things that can be, honestly, and this sounds, I feel snobby when I think it, but it can be hard to read a book set in New York when they just so clearly get things wrong. Like people don't have cars in New York, and like there aren't parking lots, and like you wouldn't drive to the grocery store or even like the subway. Like it's so disgusting on the platforms. They're like, oh, they got like a soda, you know, at the subway station. I'm like, you do not grab a subway, or you don't grab a soda at the subway station. So it's those little things that, yeah, I do get nitpicky. And I don't even know, this sounds really bad, but sometimes if there's a romance that's set in New York, I will first look up the author, and if she hasn't lived in New York, I'm like,
yeah.
You know, I opt not to sometimes.
I usually, when I read a romance set in New York for the podcast, I usually try to have a friend or guest that is from New York or has lived there at some point, because I feel like New York, above all the other cities, is the one that so many people get wrong, like between New York and LA. And I've lived in LA too, so I know if we're talking about getting to places in less than 20 minutes, like it's a lie, because that is just not real.
And, you know, and it's great that you bring that up, because living in Seattle, and I did live in Seattle proper, so like that's a big city in my head, But then you kind of think like, okay, well, New York's a big city, and San Francisco, which I went to college in that area. So like that was
Oh, okay.
another city I had in mind. And then LA, I hadn't, I've been to like Disneyland or whatever, but I hadn't really been. And you do think until you go there that like a big city is a big city, and you don't realize they have characters. They're
Mm-hmm.
so different. In LA and New York, like their populations are similar ish, not really, but they're both huge, but they're totally different. You can't go to LA and think, oh, I've been to LA, so I'll write about New York, and not vice versa either, because they're different beasts.
Yeah, no,
So
for sure. I mean, I wouldn't even pretend like I knew how to write about anything in New York. Like it's, it's just something that's so outside of what I know. LA, I can write about. San Francisco area, I can write about. Even Chicago, I was in for a couple years, so I feel like I'd be
same.
okay at that one. We've lived everywhere. Look at us.
I know. We're sort of like I'll call comparing this.
Oh God, I know. Well, I love seeing like the different, not just like big cities, but like I'm currently in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, and I just love seeing like what every area has to offer. And I feel like it's different. Like this story would have been somewhat different if it was set in LA versus Seattle versus, Minneapolis. I mean, yes, the hope is still there and the love is still there, but I don't know if she would have necessarily owned a champagne shop in, Midtown if she was in
Right.
Minneapolis.
Exactly. And there is a walkability in New York that I think is unusual
Yeah.
in US cities. Um, and public transportation as well, but specifically, like, I tend to set mine in Manhattan, which is where I live, and people do just walk everywhere. Like, you walk to the park, you walk to the food truck, you walk home, you walk to work. You're just always kind of moving, and that really does allow, especially in the romantic space, because you don't have to get into a car and like say goodbye to
Yeah.
each other. It is easy to be like, oh, well, I'm going to 6th and Broadway. Okay, I'm going to 8th and 32nd, and they can walk together for that distance, and then they can have a conversation, which for an author is fantastic. Whereas, if I'm sitting at somewhere else, and if they're going to two different places, they would get in their car and drive
Oh,
their
yeah.
separate ways, or get on separate, subways or trains or
I mean,
whatever.
there's a reason that even though we film so many movies and TV shows in LA, that hardly any romantic story is set in LA because it is
So
not
true.
it is not a romantic city to fall in love. I mean, you don't walk anywhere. There's no opportunities for like
Yep.
walking and holding hands. You have to get into your cars, drive in opposite directions. Like you're lucky if you match with somebody on a dating app that lives on the same side of town as you. And if they live by the beach, that's it. That's never going to happen.
Right. Yep. And I haven't spent a ton of time there, but yeah, my in-laws live in Southern California, and even just the space between like Orange County and San Diego
Oh,
and LA, and all the beach towns in LA, and like you think they're going to be kind of similar, but like they're different worlds.
yep.
Like it's not, it's not just LA the way it is Manhattan. It's wildly,
And
wildly
on a
different.
map, it looks like it's so much closer together than it actually is. But
Yep.
that's why I'm still single. Because that's the only reason. Well, I will say, once again, To Stir with Love, it's available June 29th. Lauren, I would love to know what's up next for you after this book.
So next up, the I will say the confirmed one. I do have a couple of things up my sleeve that I'm trying to figure out. So I will
Okay.
speak to them because my readers will get mad. It's another speaking. This is a great segue. You set it up perfectly. Next confirmed book is Made in Manhattan.
Love it.
Um, and that is made MADE, not made like
J-Lo.
MAID, which is not that. I went back and forth with the publisher, and I'm like, can we do that? Because like when you say it aloud, it sounds like it's a direct copy of that. Totally different thing. That will be out in January of 2022, and that is actually super fun. It's sort of a reverse Pygmalion story. So we've got
Ooh.
a socialite who's making over this very like kind of like rough around the edges guy from Louisiana. And she has to turn him into this sort of like boardroom ready guy. So it's a total fairy tale. Like there's so many parts of it. I'm like, this is ridiculous, and I love it.
I love it. I
Um,
love it already. I mean, that's my fairy
right? Like
tale.
I just love those kind of things. So that's happening, and then yeah, that's actually all I'm going to say because the other ones are not confirmed. But
Okay, well, and then thinking, I know you mentioned that this book had been on your bucket list for a while, so I'm curious, something that I always want to know from authors is what else is on your bucket list? Like, is there a story that you are dying to tell? A story that, you know, you have to write at some point?
Yeah, there are actually a couple, and if any publishers are listening, do you want it? Um, but one is actually, and I'm hoping this one will be coming down the line for me soon because I've actually started it and I love it. I just haven't had the time to finish it. But it comes from, this is back when I'm not on Instagram anymore, but I was on Instagram for a while, and somebody had messaged me a screenshot about this story that they'd read, I think on Twitter. But basically, there was a woman sitting on a plane, and she was on, I think, Tinder. I don't actually know how Tinder works, but she, like, whatever, a guy came up and she swiped no, or whatever, swiped no. And the guy behind her said, like, hard pass on that guy, huh? And she turns around and it was that guy. Isn't that great? And someone's like, you have to write a story on this. Is that, like, I get like chills when I think about it. So I'm working on one. It's called You Again, and it's basically that story, but it's a bar. It's not a plane. I didn't want to, like, copy this person's life, but basically, this woman, I love it. She's sitting in a bar and she stood up for a date. She's really, like, grumpy, and she's like, not that guy. And then the guy next to her is like, hard pass on that guy, huh? And then they keep running into each other. So it's almost, it's the
Yes.
story of the one that had been passed on to me, but also a little bit of Pride and Prejudice, where you have this terrible first impression, and then the process of sort of, like, unweaving those threads of
Yeah.
that wrong first impression.
Of,
Just
like, who
excites
is
me.
this person? You know, like, I can't
Yep,
tell
yep.
off of a picture.
Exactly. And, like, oh, I got it wrong. Like, sometimes we're so sure, we look at someone, like, I know what he or she is like, and then you talk to him for 5 minutes and you're like, oh, have to eat crow. So there's that one. And then another one I really love is, I guess, a lot of dating apps. Maybe it's because I've never done dating apps because I married my high school sweetheart and I'm
Okay,
obsessed with them.
stop bragging.
So, but, like, I love them. There's so many stories that you can do there,
Yeah.
but it was one where heroine basically meets a prince. And
Mm.
they fall into this whole, like, world because he's whatever wants a real girl, and they've had this kind of whirlwind romance. But then actually, she falls in love with the bodyguard
I love
and
a
not
good
the prince.
bodyguard romance.
I do,
Mm.
and that's so, yeah. It's kind of like, I want to write a story about a prince, and I want to write a bodyguard romance, and I'm like, oh, I can combine them. So that's on my bucket list.
Yes. Well,
Yeah.
and as much as you're here for, like, the dating app stories, for me, my kryptonite is, like, anything that's set around, like, a reality TV show competition. Like, those are, like, the books that I just nom 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 inhale like candy. And so those are all the
Okay.
ones that I'm always looking for.
This is going to be, like, super, like, plug, but if you haven't read Runaway Groom, which was one
I
of mine,
haven't.
actually, it's kind of a two-book series, but the first one is more like the lead up to the reality show. Runaway Groom is actually
Okay.
is the filming of the show, and it's basically The Bachelor, except instead of leading up to a proposal, it leads up to a wedding. Um,
Yes.
and so the whole idea is it's jilted, and instead of it being like a regular old bachelor, it's a guy that has major trouble with commitments, and all of the bachelors, so to speak, are runaway grooms. So
Oh
they're
my
specifically getting
God.
guys that have left women at the altar, and then they bring them in, and the idea is, like, can we finally get him down the aisle? And it's one of my favorite. Actually, it's probably I've written like 40 books, and it's, like, in my top 3 of my own. So
I love it.
I'm gonna
Well,
recommend that one to you.
and I will take that recommendation. I knew Laura from What to Read Next Pod. She is a huge fan of yours, and she was so excited that you and I were going to talk. And she said, well, ask Lauren about all of her, like, wedding book recommendations, because I know she's written some. And this episode is dropping in our June month of the theme is wedding season. So this is perfect. We've got recommendations and, more to read. I'm going to add this to my list immediately because I am a hoe for weddings. I absolutely love any reality TV show competition. So this is everything I want in life.
Love it.
This is fabulous. So, Lauren, this has been delightful. As we wrap things up, I know you mentioned you're not on Instagram anymore. Where can everybody find and follow you and, pick up your books?
Yeah, so I'm a little bit scandalous in the fact that I'm actually not on any social media,
Good
which
for
I know
you. I mean,
it is.
that's amazing.
It has been, I won't go into it because we're out of time. It's been one of the best things I've ever done, but I do
Ah,
miss readers. So the one thing I will say is if you go to my website, I have a new thing that says reader group, and it's not a Facebook group because I'm not on Facebook, but I do have a, set up. I do Q&A. There's no assistant. It's
awesome.
just me. We talk about books that we recommend. That's where I give my updates. So that is the best place. And then of course, if you just want notifications on book releases, my newsletter I send out reliably.
I
So.
love that. The fact that you can, be an author in 2021 and not have social media is incredible. I mean, people take notes. Like, I think a lot more people would like to be in your shoes right now.
Yeah, yeah, it is. I mean, like people always say, like, "Oh, I wish I could do that," And I'm like, "Well, to be honest, it's not without consequences." There is like you can't. I'm probably not selling as many books, but it's just in terms of balancing mental health versus career growth.
Yeah.
The mental health is an important part
Oh,
for me.
absolutely. Whatever works for you. And that is, I mean, you're not going to write the books if you don't feel up to doing it. So, I mean, mental health for me, happiness, it comes number one above all else.
Yeah.
So, that's awesome. I'm glad you're able, to do that and also take care of you. And a final reminder to Sir with Love, it's available June 29th. And if you want some little extra bonus content, you can join Boobies and Newbies on Patreon because you better believe Lauren and I started this conversation out by talking about peanut butter.
Like a long conversation about peanut butter, not a
Yeah.
passing reference.
And
Like we got into it.
there was some like leftovers for breakfast conversation
Yeah.
because again, any excuse to talk about food on this podcast is an absolutely must. So now that we've done that, I feel like I might have to start the day with like a peanut butter sandwich, thanks to you.
That's exactly. I'm like down here. I'm like, what time is it? I'm like, oh, since I don't care about meals, I'm like, maybe I'll try your oatmeal. That's what I'll have for lunch.
Yes, yes, yes. It's peanut butter
Breaking all the
oatmeal
rules.
time. I love it. Well, thank you again, Lauren. This has been absolutely delightful. And I can't wait for everybody to read this book. And I can't wait for me to go read your Runaway Groom book.
Yes, I hope you love it, and thank you so much for having me. I had the best time.
Thanks so much for listening. Boobies and Newbies is part of the Frolic Podcast Network. Find more podcasts you'll love at frolic.media/podcasts. You can follow Boobies and Newbies on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Boobies Podcast.